Will you please welcome the very awesome Rebeccawatson?
Thank you. Thank you very much for what I can only assume was a lovely introduction. I have been learning Norwegian. Just before I came over here, I downloaded a free podcast called 1 Minute Norwegian. And so if you don't mind, I'll just try a little bit out for you, okay? Here we go. Hi. Ja. Nei. That's it. Thanks. Yeah. It turns out you actually do get what you pay for, so yeah. I'm asked to do this talk quite a bit now on why chicks matter. And the reason is because these conferences tend to be very guy-heavy, lots of men in attendance. And the conference organizers often want to know what they can do to attract more women. And I try to help them out on that count. And I was looking through the little pamphlet here today, and I came across something that, I don't know, maybe for next year you might want to consider amending. If you look at your schedule, you'll see, 1715, Rebeccawatson, and then slut. So, I mean, maybe don't do that next year. Just a thought. I mean, it's true, but maybe don't point it out. So yeah, this talk is called Why Chicks Matter. It's called that because if I had called it, a conversation on feminism, none of you would have shown up. So it's kind of my sneaky way to talk about feminism with a bunch of people who I suspect haven't really given feminism much thought. And it might be because you just never really thought that it applied to you. Maybe you're a man and you think it's just for the ladies. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about feminism. And I think that there's actually a lot of good overlap between feminists and skeptics, and it can benefit everyone to learn more about, for skeptics to learn more about feminism, and for feminists to learn more about skepticism. So this is basically what the talk is about. I thought we'd start by just defining the term, because that's always an issue. Everybody has a different definition. This is the one that I use, and this is the one that I feel most working feminists today use. It's pretty simple, just the advocacy of women's rights on the grounds of sexual equality. So from there, hopefully we can move forward and maybe talk about a few things that feminists aren't. These are some misconceptions I think come up quite often, which is, I picked out just the main three. The first one being that feminists are man-hating assholes. The second, that it's incompatible with skepticism. And the third, that feminism is completely obsolete. So I'm going to walk you through these 3 points over the course of my talk, starting with the idea that feminists hate men. This is the point where you take a picture of this slide and you put it up on the internet, and I get a lot of angry emails from feminists who aren't here. So no, feminists don't necessarily hate men. I do, but no, just kidding. No, I love dudes. And in fact, not only do feminists not always hate men, but a lot of men consider themselves feminists, and I think that's great. In fact, if you look at the breakdown of who reads Skepchick, my website, which covers skepticism and feminism, it's pretty interesting. We did a survey last year. We found that 63% of our readership is male, and 36.5% is female, and a little less than 1% considers themselves transgendered. So as you can see, lady topics can actually be of interest to men. And I think that a lot of our male readership would consider themselves feminists. I found a really interesting quote on PZ Meyer's blog. PZ considers himself a feminist, and he posted about feminism and the problem with the lack of women at skeptics conferences and things like that. So this was a comment. Basically, the guy is saying, I'll just read it to you. To put a rather blunt case forward, a writer whose primary output is on the subject of feminist skepticism should not be all that disappointed or angry that they find a limited audience outside female skeptics. If Richard Dawkins mainly wrote about evolution and its implications for old white guys, he would lack audience. But his writings are general to the subject and thus more accessible/relevant to more people. This is a pattern among those who are dominant. Their writings are less personal and more general. I thought that this was really interesting because what he's saying is that, Skepchick shouldn't have a large audience because we do talk about feminist skepticism and a lot of feminist issues. And yet, actually, we have quite a good group of readers. We get about, I think we're up to about 10,000 visitors a day, which I think is pretty good. And so I was thinking about this comment in terms of some of the other conferences I go to, the skeptic conferences I go to. And I noticed that one topic that I hear discussed, quite often at skeptics conferences are cryptozoological things. So like Bigfoot, Yetis. This is a Yeti corn. He's thinking about pudding, I don't know. So I was actually at this conference last year where I saw Joe Nickell give a wonderful talk. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Joe Nickell, but he's absolutely lovely. And he goes out and he basically investigates ghosts, hauntings, things like that, and also mysterious creatures that are lurking in lakes and wilderness areas. And so I listened to him give a really interesting talk to a rapt audience of about 1,000 people about otters in a lake and how when they jump, they sort of look like the humps on a sea serpent. And everybody found that really interesting, even though it really has no relevance at all to your everyday life. I hope. I mean, it's kind of weird if it does. And I thought about that compared to a girly topic that this commenter was saying wouldn't have relevance to your daily life. One of my favorite topics to discuss at these talks, and also on Skepchick, is douching. Mostly because it makes people really uncomfortable. And just so we're clear, I'm not talking about douche as in the French for shower. I'm talking about douche as in a vinegary substance that women in America, and I think it's spread a bit to England now as well, where women are encouraged to shoot this vinegar into their vagina in order to make them clean. And it's horrific. I mean, because you don't put vinegar in your vagina. By the way, I'm going to say vagina a lot. Hope that's okay. So yeah, that's basically what douche is. And douche became popular in the, I guess in the 70s in America with these terrible commercials with a girl going to her mother and saying, "Mom, do you ever get that not so fresh feeling?" And her mother goes, "Yes, sweetie, here. Rinse out your vagina with vinegar." I mean, it's, and it doesn't make you clean. The vagina, in case you don't know, is a rather self-cleaning organ. You don't need to do anything like that to it. And in fact, when you wash your vagina out with vinegar, it actually, basically it's like dropping like a firebomb into your vagina, and it clears out all of the bacteria. And this is a bad thing. You need certain bacteria in your body to help keep things moving. So when you flush out your vagina like that, it leaves you open to infections. And those infections can lead to some pretty serious complications like sterility. So douching is not only not good for you, it doesn't do anything for you, but it's actually actively bad for you. And it's still being promoted in commercials on television in the States. There was a recent ad in Women's Day magazine, so magazine obviously devoted to women, and this is what it was: confidence at work, how to ask for a raise. And in case you're wondering, if you can't read that, the very first tip for how a woman should ask for a raise at work is to start with your usual routine and all the things you do to feel your best, including showering with summer's eve feminine wash. Feminine wash is what they call douche, now that we turned douche into an insult. So yeah, basically they're telling you to clean out your vagina before you go and ask for a raise. Where do they think women work? I don't think that's legal. And also they say, or throw a packet of Summer's Eve feminine cleansing cloth, into your bag for a quick freshness pick-me-up during the day. You know, when I'm at work and I want to pick-me-up, I get a cup of coffee. I don't go to the bathroom and wash out my vagina with vinegar. It's just not done. So douching, you might think that it's a topic that's only relevant to women, I guess. But is it? I mean, even if you're a man, surely even the nerdiest of you know a woman. You know, unless you're like locked in the basement playing World of Warcraft day in, day out. No, surely you have a sister, a girlfriend, a wife, a mother, who might read something like this or watch one of their not-so-fresh commercials and get the idea that this is a perfectly healthy thing for them to be doing, when in fact it can be terribly dangerous. And isn't that the sort of thing that skeptics like to point out? I think a huge part of skepticism is consumer protection, making sure that people aren't getting ripped off by scams. I think douche is a scam, and it's a very dangerous one, but nobody talks about it because it's a girl problem, and we don't like talking about vaginas. But I think we should, and I think it has relevance. So, yeah, men can be feminists as well, and the topics can be interesting, even to you. So the next, look, I included a close-up. Aren't I clever? The next thing I wanted to talk about is the idea that feminism isn't compatible with skepticism. And I get where this misconception comes from. I think it comes from, we hear these feminists occasionally get press for saying really, really stupid things. Things like, oh, well, science is a male way of knowing, and we don't need that, so we tap into our female way of knowing. Our intuition, we use intuition and emotions instead of logic. And yeah, that's total bullshit. But that doesn't really represent all of feminism. And to give you another example, last year, in the US, the government convened a panel of doctors to look at breast cancer screenings. At the time, the screenings were recommended for all women beginning when they were 40 years of age. This panel looked over all the evidence, looked at how many tumors are we catching, how many lives are we saving by having these women screened at 40. And they found that it actually wasn't worth it, that women should start getting regularly screened at the age of 50. The reason why is that they said that between 40 and 50, all you really get are false positives, meaning that doctors are seeing lumps that aren't cancerous, they're giving women these terrible scares, and putting them through a lot of unnecessary procedures that end up not saving any lives. There was a post on a feminist blog I read, feminist law professors, and they criticized the panel's ruling. They said things like, if the federal government is so concerned about women's anxieties, how about more jobs, affordable childcare, lower tax rates, clean air to breathe, and an end to discrimination? Which, like, yeah, I'm sure as soon as this panel is done worrying about women's breast cancer, they're going to focus on discrimination. It was kind of odd for me to read. Basically, this writer felt that the panel's only reason for pushing back the age was to limit women's anxieties so that the poor little girls wouldn't have to worry, which is completely untrue. They were looking at evidence, and they were trying to save more lives and cause less problems, putting women through fewer procedures. and actually saving lives in that context, because women aren't getting pelted with x-rays and going through other procedures that could be quite harmful to them if they aren't at risk for cancer. The good news is that from the very first comment on this blog, the readership pointed these things out because they were more skeptical than the writer. And I love seeing that, because these are people who identify as feminists who are actually skeptics. And they were doing a great job of rebutting this writer's points. And that's kind of what I want to say, is that, yeah, so you've got this big world of feminism. There are going to be some non-skeptical feminists. But that doesn't mean that all feminists aren't skeptical. And to give you sort of an example, let's look at atheism. Atheism has its fair share of people who aren't skeptical. I think a lot of skeptics and atheists like to think that the overlap is 100%. But I don't know if you guys are familiar with Bill Maher, but he's a very popular TV personality, I suppose you would call him, in America. And he is anti-vaccination. He believes that the government is trying to kill us, that pharmaceutical companies are just trying to take our money. Well, actually, that one's sort of true, but that the pharmaceutical companies will kill us in order to take our money, which I believe is not true. And he actively tells his large audience to avoid vaccines. He is not skeptical. He is an atheist, though, and so a lot of skeptics and atheists really look up to him. He made a movie called Religulous, in which he criticized religion, and for that, Richard Dawkins gave him an award last year. And a lot of skeptics stepped up and said, could you please not reward this person who's helping to cause deaths? He's helping to spread measles, basically, by telling people not to vaccinate their children. And so that's what I want to say, basically, is that atheism without skepticism is blind. And it's the same thing with feminism. So you can have skeptical feminists, and I think that feminists are all the better for it. So the two are, in fact, compatible. The third thing I'd like to talk about is the concept that feminism is obsolete. I was on a podcast last year, and I was speaking to these two guys, and I don't even remember the name of the podcast, or else I would mock them more. But one of the guys said, Rebecca, do you consider yourself a feminist? And I said, yes. And he said, well, I don't understand what you do, because you guys got the right to vote. I was like, oh my God, you're right. You know what? I'm going to go into the next feminism conference, and I'm just going to be like, you know what, everybody, pack it in. We don't need to do any more work. We got the vote. No, actually, there are a ton of other things that feminists are doing right now. And not only that, but feminists are out there doing things that skeptics could really get behind. To give you an example, I want to go back briefly to the breast cancer screenings. There actually was a problem with the screenings, with the government panel's recommendation. And the problem was mostly picked up by feminist blogs. They pointed out that breast cancer is very different in African American women. So the panel was recommending that the average woman wait until the age of 50 to go get screened. But they didn't mention that the average woman is white. And that meant that a large portion of the population, African American women, were being misled. Because you see, breast cancer in African American women tends to be, it tends to come on earlier, and it tends to be much, much more aggressive. So it kills these women at a younger age. So it's very important for them to go in earlier and get screened. This was picked up by the feminist blogs, and it was picked up by one skeptic blog that I noticed, which was Orak of science blogs. If you don't read him, you should. He's fantastic. And it just so happens that he's a breast cancer researcher. So he pointed this out as well. So that's one topic that I think is both a feminist issue and it's also a skeptical issue. And I'm going to go through just a couple of more issues like that to give you a few more examples. Starting with birth control. I think it's very interesting because I want to talk about basically abstinence-only education, which is something that I thought was just a US thing, because we tend to have all of the real religious nutters. I don't know if you have a word for nutters, crazy people, fundamentalists, who are basically preaching abstinence-only education, and they're pushing the government to make it standard in all of our schools. And there have been a lot of studies on abstinence-only education. Here's one from 2005. It found, although abstinence from sexual intercourse represents a healthy behavioral choice for adolescents, policies or programs offering abstinence only or abstinence until marriage as a single option for adolescents are scientifically and ethically flawed. This was a huge meta-analysis that looked at all of the studies to date, and it was pretty damn conclusive, actually. They said, although federal support of abstinence-only programs has grown rapidly since 1996, existing evaluations of such programs either do not meet standards for scientific evaluation or lack evidence of efficacy in delaying initiation of sexual intercourse. So, I mean, the science is in, and it says that abstinence-only education just doesn't work. This is one from just the other day, actually, the 20th. The CDC found that in regions where they teach abstinence-only education, the teen pregnancy rate is much, much, much higher than in US states where they get a comprehensive program of sexual education. So again and again and again, we get to the point that abstinence-only education does not work. The science is in. However, we have all these groups that are working hard to get abstinence-only taught in our schools. And I found out that it's not just in the US. This is, oh, I forgot to move it forward, that would help. This is an action alert from the British Humanist Association, calling for people to help out and fight against a Catholic group that was lobbying MPs in order to provide funding to schools for abstinence-only education and to allow federally funded schools to teach abstinence-only. So long as it's like they kind of had a religious sort of bypass. You know, we're going to teach our kids this because that's our religion. Not because of anything the science says, because they don't have science to back them up. They only have pseudoscience. And unfortunately, it's not just in the UK. By the way, that's passed, I believe, or it's on its way to passing. Izzy, do you know? You don't know, do you? No. Yeah, I think it's about to pass, actually. So federally funded schools will be able to teach abstinence-only education in England. So that's abstinence-only education. There's another issue concerning birth control, which I also thought was limited to the US, and that's the idea that a pharmacist can deny a woman birth control. This happens usually in rural areas in the US. What happens is the woman goes in with a prescription for birth control and asks the pharmacist to fill it, and he says, no, my religion doesn't approve of birth control, and therefore I'm not going to fill that prescription. So women in rural areas are left with no options, really, except for to have a baby. This also includes doctors who are allowed to conscientiously object to performing abortions. But it does go all the way down to the birth control level. Well, unfortunately, it's not just in the US. It's in the UK. They recently, well, this one was back in March. There was a pharmacy code that was drafted that said that pharmacists could, in fact, say, no, I'm not going to fill that prescription for you, which is fundamentally impacting women's health over religion, over pseudoscience. And it's not just the UK, it's actually all over Europe, you lucky guys. This is recent. A pro-life lobby went after European Parliament. I forget what the actual, Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, sorry. they were debating basically updating the rules to what Norway practices, which is, I believe this is still true here, but you have a list of pharmacists who say, it's against my religion to fill this prescription. However, they have to be on that list, and they have to provide women with other options. There has to be, for instance, another pharmacist on staff who can step in and fill that prescription at all times. Or there must be another pharmacy within a certain distance that the woman can go to get her prescription filled. Unfortunately, a pro-life group stepped in, a religious group, and lobbied quite hard, and they got the bill changed so that it now says pretty much the opposite. It now says that pharmacists are allowed to conscientiously object, and the women have no recourse. They don't have to provide the women with any other option. So I looked into it. Oop, I went back, didn't I? Computers scare me. So I looked into it a bit. European Center for Law and Justice, that's the group that was lobbying to allow pharmacists the right to deny women their health care. So I went to their website, and I found that they were affiliated with the American Center for Law and Justice. So apparently came from America. I found that the American Center for Law and Justice was founded by Pat Robertson. Not sure if you're familiar with him, but he's a faith healer who has a big TV show in the US. He's founded a ton of other organizations. And you might have heard of him when Haiti got hit by the earthquake, and he claimed that it was because they made a pact with the devil. Also, I think the hurricane hit New Orleans because of all the sex that was happening there. And 9/11, I think, was because of the gays. I think the gays caused 9/11, according to Pat Robertson. So you know what? You're welcome. That one's courtesy of American Jesus. So there is a serious problem here, though, because denying women access to contraception does lead to some serious consequences. It's lack of education for young women. They're forced to have children that they don't want. Often they have to drop out of school at an early age. There's a social stigma attached for both the woman and her family and the baby. You increase mortality rates because women are forced to carry babies to term that would, that have a chance of killing them. It also increases the amount of unsafe and illegal abortions. There was a study done just a few months ago that found that making abortion illegal doesn't stop abortion. It just kills more women. The women will find a way to get an abortion. It's just incredibly unsafe for them. Denying contraception can also lead to an increase in HIV and AIDS if you're denying them condoms, which unfortunately is beginning to happen as well and has been happening for some time in other areas like Africa. So again, we find a topic that I think is both a feminist issue and a skeptical issue. It still touches on the same things. It's about our healthcare being affected, and our healthcare is being affected by pseudoscience. The science is behind us on this one. So I, for one, would like to see more skeptics team up and help defeat these religious fundamentalists that are impacting women's health in such a negative way. So this one is, unfortunately, kind of dark. I'm going to talk a little bit about FGM, which is also known as female genital mutilation. And if you're not familiar with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I recommend you pick up her book, Infidel. It's terrifying, actually. And she talks about getting circumcised. And it's quite a horrific passage, but also very moving, and it encouraged me to learn more about the practice and why it's so prevalent and why it's so dangerous and how we can stop it. She talks a bit about why girls get circumcised, and the reasons she quotes is this idea that they'll be possessed by devils, they'll fall into vice and perdition, they'll become whores. These actually, do I even have to say? The science does not back this up. Here's path.org did an interesting survey in different countries asking them for the reasons why they circumcise women. And I don't want to go into too much detail on it because it's quite graphic. But in case you're not aware, female circumcision covers, like the term, or female genital mutilation as a term, covers a wide array of practices. And it can involve, just a small nick up to full removal of the genitals. And unfortunately, often it falls in the middle where it can actually be quite deadly to little girls who can get infections. They can lose a lot of blood. Often what's happened is, it's practiced on kitchen tables with unsterilized equipment, and people don't necessarily know what they're doing. Not that if they knew what they were doing, it would be much less barbaric. But the reason why they say they do it is because good tradition. So it's very much a cultural thing. Also that it's a religious requirement. They believe that it's cleaner, which is laughable. If you know anything about the practice and its result, it often results in seeping wounds and other horrific things that I won't mention because we're going to dinner soon. They believe that it'll preserve their virginity, which actually might be true because after they're done, they sew up the woman and leave a very tiny hole for her to pee through. And on her wedding night, that whole, those stitches are cut open, usually with a knife. It offers the women better marriage prospects. They claim it enhances male sexual pleasure. That's important. And that it prevents promiscuity, which that one might be true. I know I wouldn't be sleeping around if that's the situation I was in. It's not just happening in poor developing countries. Forward UK is a group that's battling this in the UK. They say they're estimating that 6,500 girls in the UK every year are at risk. And it's also happening here in Norway. Norway is actually pretty good on this front in that it is illegal here. But the problem is that, and actually I should mention that it's also been made illegal in the US and many other countries. But the problem that all these countries are finding is how to enforce it. You've made the law. How do you stop these girls from getting circumcised? I was looking into it a bit about the issue here in Norway, and I found that in 2000 there was a documentary by TV2 that exposed 3 African imams who would arrange these vacations to countries where they could have girls mutilated. And it's been continuing for the past 10 years. Unfortunately, it apparently hasn't gotten much better. The girl that was in this documentary, here we go. Oh, and this is a quote. This is a direct quote from the documentary from an imam. As I'm sure you'll understand, we Muslims must be careful with what we say here in Norway. It is not necessary to include too many in these matters. I myself, for instance, have 2 wives. That is also prohibited in Norway. When my wife visits me from the Gambia, I tell the Norwegian government that it is my sister or my aunt. The same discretion should go for what you are bringing up, meaning female genital mutilation. So if there's a law, they find a way around it. I know in the US, what's happening is the groups that are really working hard to stop this it's not the police, it's not the government, because they just don't have the funding and they don't have the power or the knowledge to do it. The people who are doing it are grassroots organizations, grassroots feminist organizations that are specifically set up to speak to the women in these communities and educate them about the actual effects of female genital mutilation and teach them that it's not something that they have to do. So this is another case where I think that it's both a feminist issue and a skeptical issue, because how great would it be if the skeptics here could step forward and contact these grassroots organizations and offer to help out? Because again, we're talking about women's health, people are being directly impacted by pseudoscience and by religion and superstition. And these are things that we can help fight by educating people. So, you might not necessarily be able to go into the communities yourself, but there are people who can, and they need your help. They need your support, your money, even your time. And I think skeptics can actually make a difference in this regard. So I'll talk about one final issue. Since it's Halloween, I'll talk a bit about witchcraft. Oh, and actually I should mention, before I move on from the FGM, the girl in that documentary from 2000, basically they sent her undercover to these imams, and she told them that her family was trying to ship her off to get circumcised, which was true. And the imams told her that it was for the best. She went into hiding. She had to go into hiding just after the documentary came out because of the reaction in her community, mostly amongst the men. And she, after 7 years, in 2007, she figured it was finally time to come out of hiding, and she was promptly beaten. And I think she's gone back into hiding now. So these women definitely need our help. So witchcraft. Not going to talk about the fun kind of Halloween witches. I apologize. I apologize that this is such a downer. I know that this is a downer, but don't worry, we're going to power through. This is the last one. I want to tell you about a really amazing woman named Juliana Bernard. And here's a direct quote from her. She grew up in a very rural community in Somalia. And unlike most other kids in her community, she was taught by her parents that illness is caused by disease and germs, not bad spirits. Now, to this audience, that would probably seem like a fairly obvious statement. But it's amazing what people will do when they don't understand a simple thing, a seemingly simple thing like germ theory. What they do is when people fall ill or when crops die, they try to find the source. And they often find the source in people who are already different or already oppressed. And in these communities, what Juliana saw was that these people were turning on the older women in the villages. They felt that these women were witches. The reasons why were because they had bloodshot eyes and they owned property, unlike other women. They seemed very, wise, much too wise for an uneducated woman. And so these women were driven out of their communities, driven out of their homes. They were beaten, they were murdered. And I'm using the past tense, but I shouldn't because it's still happening. Juliana's still out there basically fighting against this. And what she does, funded by feminist organizations, she goes from village to village and she teaches them germ theory. Basically, she's like the African James Randi. She's like going out and debunking witches. And it's having an amazing effect. This is a quote from one of the villagers that a reporter interviewed shortly after Juliana came to town. "Before we blamed polio on witches and punished them, but it didn't stop polio. Then we got the polio vaccinations and we all stopped developing polio. We could see that modern medicine works." Juliana brought in vaccines. She taught them germ theory. She figured out that the women had bloodshot eyes because they'd been working over stoves their whole lives, and the smoke was going into their eyes. So she got them new chimneys, which was such a simple solution. But she got them chimneys that carried the smoke up past them, so their eyes cleared up. And she taught them, she taught them that these women aren't to be feared. And the impact has been incredible. The women are now allowed to live in peace. If you go online, you can find this article, and it's absolutely amazing. It was written by Johan Hari in The Independent, I believe. I'll just give you one more quote from Johan. He says, "Just the smallest drop of rationality can, it seems, kill these superstitions stone dead." And isn't that really what we do as skeptics? that I think in general, that's our goal, is to kill superstition in a way that can really make a difference. And I think that Juliana is the perfect example of a skeptic who is out there getting things like that done. Who's supporting her, though? Feminists. Feminists are supporting her. And I think that skeptics should be supporting her, too, because she's doing skeptical work. And so that's kind of the reason why I like to include her at the end of this, because I want you to see that these people are doing real good work that, that we can get behind. And that's why I like to end with this, because I like to talk about the 5 stages of disbelief, which is something that I've thought about quite a bit lately, because I've noticed this happening. I think the first stage, is when someone just believes everything. We've all been there, I think, for the most part. And then you realize that one thing in your life is bullshit. And so maybe you look it up online and you debunk it and you get really excited because that was fun. And then you start looking at other things with the same sort of skeptical lens, and you realize that there's a lot of bullshit out there, Bigfoot and UFOs and homeopathy and all that. And then you find the skeptical community. And I love this stage because this is where I get these amazing emails from people who say that, they live in the Bible Belt in the US and they're surrounded by religious fundamentalists and, pseudoscience and superstition, and they thought they were the only one. But then they found Skepchick, or they found the Skeptics Guide to the Universe, and they've realized that there's other people like them. And usually when I give these talks, I feel like that's the stage that most of the people in the audience are at. You found this community, and it's exciting, and you're going to these talks, and you're meeting other skeptics, and it's really cool. But the best thing, I think, is what happens after these meetings, because that's when I actually get even better emails. They come from people who go away from this meeting all invigorated and ready to actually do something. They want to start their own blog or do a podcast or start a Skeptics in the pub in their little town, and they want to know how they can do it. And so I really like to try to move people from that 4th stage to the 5th stage, because I think the more people we have out there actually doing things, the more stuff gets done, I guess. So, here are a few suggestions of things you can do. There are a few feminist organizations that could use some skeptics who agree with a lot of the things I've been talking about today. You can use your votes. You can get involved in your government and make sure that bills like those horrible abstinence-only bills and the ones about pharmacists being allowed to deny women health care, make sure that stuff isn't getting passed by letting your representatives know that you care about the issue. And then you can also go online. You can send stories to your favorite skeptical writers that are about these topics. I find that, we get, for Skepchick and for Skeptics Guide to the Universe, a lot of the topics we cover are things that are recommended to us by our readers. So if you have a favorite blogger or a podcaster and you feel like they're missing a big story, let them know. You'd be surprised how many people will take you up on that. I also recommend that you visit feminist blogs, because the thing is, I am not the best person to be talking to you about feminism. The reason why I do it is because I'm usually the only girl. So I feel like it's my duty to do it. But there's a lot more out there in terms of feminist theory, and there's a lot more to learn. So I recommend you go learn more about feminism, and then visit the blogs, because think back to the breast cancer screening thing. If there weren't skeptics on that site, then they would have just gone on, spouting bullshit to other feminists. So I think the more skeptics we have who are informed about feminism, who can get involved in the community and make them more skeptical, the better off they'll be. And then just to end, here are a few blogs that already, I think, combine feminism and skepticism, if you want to learn more. Skepchick, of course. Amanda Marcotte at Pandagon. Bug Girl is a skeptic, or a skepchick, who has her own blog. P.Z. Myers, I mentioned, is a feminist. Mike the Mad Biologist, Greg Layden, ICES, a lot of good science blog stuff. The F Word is a UK blog that's for feminism. And my friend Tessa blogs at Tessera, and she helped me out a lot with a lot of the recent contraception bullshit that's happening. She's a person who's actually out there on the scenes lobbying politicians and trying to fight against fundamentalists. So definitely check out her blog. But basically, I just want to encourage you all to learn more and get involved and go away from this conference really inspired. So thank you all very much for having me here in Oslo.